Okay, so today we're going to take a look at Nikolai Gogol's The Memoirs of a Madman, sometimes translated as The Diary of a Madman, right? So initially, this short story was what he wrote first, and then later on it was turned into a play. So the play is still often performed today, and this short story is also quite famous. Now, just before we begin, this is Miro. She is a graduate student here in linguistics, and she has a special request of you guys, just quickly. So, Miro.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 대학원생인데요. 음성 실험에 참여하실 모집자를 구하고 있는데 저희가 현재 104호에서 진행을 할 거예요. 그런데 이 실험이 어떤 실험이냐면 콜덕션 실험이라서 녹음을 해주실 분들을 찾아요. 영어 센텐스 읽고 녹음을 해주시면 되는데, 그런데 토플 점수가 있으셔야지 참여가 가능해서 혹시 이분들 한국인들 중에서 100점, 토플 점수 100점 이상이나 60점에서 80점 사이에 해당하는 점수가 있으신 분들 중에 해외 거주 체류 기간이 2년 이하이신 분들을 찾고 있어요. 그래서 혹시 관심 있으시면 104호로 와서 연락해 주시면 진행 도와드리겠습니다. Right.
Okay. So, in other words, she wants to torture you. That's what she's going to. Okay. So today we're looking at Gogol's Memoirs of a Madman. That's how this translator of this story has chosen to render the title. Although, as I said, often you'll come across Diary of a Madman as the alternative English translation. Right? So same with many of these stories. They have several different translations into English, and sometimes the authors choose different titles, slightly different variations depending on their word choice and what they want to emphasize and so on. Right? So our story last time, for example, was translated from French into English, and sometimes it's translated as the elixir of long life as opposed to the elixir of life. But as you can see, they're all these are choices of translation. So, of course, the fact that it's given, that I've given you that it's this is being translated means, of course, that this story, just like the last one, was not originally written in English. You can tell me about our author, Nikolai Gogol. What can you tell me about his context? Where is he from? He's not from Russia. He's from Ukraine, right? So, of course, if you've been watching the news the last few months, right, this is, of course, quite a touchy subject because Ukraine for quite a while has been its own country. But it used to be, when Gogol was alive, it used to be part of what was the Russian Empire, right? So the Russian Tsar was the ruler over Ukraine. Okay? But Ukraine has its own language, its own culture. It's now its own country. So, and of course, Gogol himself was very proud of his Ukrainian background, and his early works and early stories and so on are all written in Ukrainian. Right? But this particular story and his most famous works, the reason why we say, Russian, is because he wrote those in Russian, and of course he's then become famous as one of the most famous Russian language writers of the 19th century. Right? But it is important to make that distinction. He is actually from Ukraine and not from Russia. Right? So yes, he's this Ukrainian Russian writer, writing in Russian, very famous in the 19th century. What else can you tell me? When was this story published? What year? 1835, right? Okay, so we've seen, again, remember our different, we said there are different times and different places where Romanticism sort of reaches its peak or where it becomes very popular, right? And we can see that in Russia, right, it's the 1820s and 1830s, and we see one of the authors that is actually mentioned in passing in this story, right? The narrator quotes from a poem is the author Alexander Pushkin, right? Who's probably like the most famous of the not only of the Russian romantics, but of Russian literature, at least from the perspective of the Russians themselves, right? So, every every tradition, every language and every nation tends to have its own like greatest writer. So in English, it would be, who would be the most famous? Right, William Shakespeare. In German, Gustav, you're German. Goethe, right? We saw Faust is very influential and many other things that he wrote, right? So in Russia, in the same way, Alexander Pushkin is particularly for his poetry, is the writer, right? That everyone in school, like primary school, high school, studies his poetry, right? And knows, like they have to memorize some of his poems and so on. So everyone knows references to him, just like in English, lots of English literature, English language literature, quotes and references Shakespeare, lots of German literature references Goethe, right? You probably had to study him in high school, right? Yeah. And so, like Germans, there are lots of German idioms and proverbs and sayings and so on that are quotations from Goethe. So, in the same way, Pushkin is this way. So, Pushkin, Gogol, Lermontov, and a series of other famous romantic Russian language writers. Some of them Russian, some of them from the larger Russian Empire, like from the Ukraine, like in Gogol's case. All right. Can anyone else tell me anything else about Gogol? Anyone know any of his famous works besides Memoirs or Diary of a Madman? No? Right? The Government Inspector, yes?
And Dead Souls.
And Dead Souls. Dead Souls is probably his most famous, right, of his works. And if you, Dead Souls gives us a very good sort of insight into the kind of ideas and sense of humor, right, and satire of the times that he's living in that Gogol is making, right? Because the main story involves a character, Chichikov, who goes around, and the souls that is referenced in the title refers to the number of serfs or peasants that you owned, right? And this is how, in the 19th century, wealth was, well, not until the serfs the serfdom was abolished, sort of like the end of slavery in other parts of the world. But while that system was in place, how many serfs that you had, and a serf is like a peasant, right? It's a peasant living on your land and working for you, right? You kind of owned them, right? So you would measure how rich someone was by how many serfs or peasants that they had, and these were referred to as how many souls that you had, right? So let's say, you are a small-time farmer, you only have 100 souls, right? You have 100 serfs, you have 100 peasants working and living on your farm. But say you're a super rich guy and you have 30,000 souls across all of your farms and all your estates, right? So you become a rich person measured by how many souls that you have. So what this guy Chichikov does is that he goes around and he wants to pretend that he is a rich person. And so he goes around to all different farmers and he finds out on your estates, on your farms, is there anyone who has died or who has run away or who's still counted as an official soul, but the law doesn't know about it yet? And he buys those for very cheap so that he can say, I'm really rich. I have thousands and thousands and thousands of souls, of people working for me, except, of course, they're all only alive on paper, right? They don't really exist. So he builds up this vast fake fortune in order to bolster his standing in society and to make it look like he's really rich. So this kind of satire, making fun of the way in which his society works at that time, is a big part of what Gogol does in his stories, right? They also, as you can see from that kind of sense of humor and from the story today, it's quite a dark, right, sort of vision, right? It's not a sort of a laugh out loud kind of humor, right? It's not something that you would be like, ha ha ha, all right, that's funny. But no, it's a more sort of like a disturbing kind of satire that we see, just like in this story. There are certain things that are amusing in a sort of a weird, twisted sort of way, but are not laugh out loud kind of funny. All right. So knowing this about our story, let's go over what happens in this story, because at times, because of the way our central character, Propashin, how he thinks, it can be a little confusing, but the first thing to always do when you look at this kind of story, of course, is the title is there to give us a clue, right? So if you're there thinking, wow, this guy seems kind of weird. Why is he doing this? Why is he behaving in this way? Why is he having these thoughts? Well, if you look at the title and you see that this is the memoirs of a madman, right? This is not the thoughts of a sane person. This is someone who is gradually sliding into, or rather quickly, sliding into madness over the course of the story, right? Then for us as readers, it makes a lot more sense, right? It's easier to see, all right, it starts out, it seems like he's kind of sane, right? He's kind of, he has a job and he's doing his everyday work, and then he starts to, experience more and more signs that he is not quite all there, right? He's not quite sane. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're reading it. The title tells us, like, watch out, right? This is not just like an ordinary memoir, ordinary diary. This is a diary of someone who is going crazy. Okay, so it makes a lot more sense when you read that with that perspective in mind. So, as I said, the hero, or the protagonist rather, he's not really a hero, he's more what we call an anti-hero, right? And this is very common for romantic fiction, right? Is that we often have heroes who are not heroic. So Rip Van Winkle, not heroic. He's the opposite of what we'd expect from a great hero, right? Similarly here, he is Propashin, whose name is only mentioned right towards the end when he's in the insane asylum, is not a hero, he's an anti-hero. So, as you can see, what voice is this written in? First person, right? And of course, we've seen this before. Which story have we read that's been in first person? Telltale Heart. Right? And both of these stories, and really most stories that you're going to come across from this period and ever since, are going to be written, if they're written in first person, as an unreliable narrator. Right? Is that when you tell something from the first person perspective, right, even if you are absolutely grounded and rational and completely sane, there's always something subjective that colors the way in which we tell a story. And so this we always take into account when we are reading something. We always know that even though the author's words or the protagonist's words are the only thing that we have to go on, nonetheless, we have to take them with a grain of salt. We can't rely upon them 100%. So in these kinds of stories, they are a skill of our critical reading abilities, aren't they? Right? We have to try and use our judgment, to use our careful reading to make sure that we, A, understand the leaps of logic that are often made, right, by the person who is speaking. So in Post-Telltale Heart, he begins by telling us, I'm completely sane, I'm not nervous, I'm very calm. And then we look at his actions and we start to think, maybe I don't quite believe what you're telling me about how calm and rational you are, right? In the same way, we see certain things that the narrator here tells us that we don't fully trust, right? Or that we see him making leaps of logic, right? Jumping from one idea to the next without, in a way that is not really justified by the connections that he's made, but that he seems to believe in his own mind. Okay. So as I said, let's go over quickly what happens in this story, because it's not told in a traditional sort of story style. A, it's a diary, right? That kind of found object that we talked about with Rip Van Winkle, right? And also, it doesn't have a sort of beginning, middle, and end neat sort of summary. Like there's no sort of like central conflict resolution like we had in the last story, right? Where we sort of, it was very clear the trajectory, of Don Juan's father dies, he lives his life, then his own turn comes, and we see what the effects are. Whereas this one, it's this gradual slide into madness. Okay, so as we see, our story begins with this character of Propashin who is a civil servant, right? And this is a feature of sort of the Russian bureaucracy of the 19th century, was that it was a huge industry, right? It was like working for the government, and it had a whole very strict set of levels and regulations that if you want to make a career out of it, you sort of had to work your way up through these levels, right? And so we see our main character, Propashin, he is poor, he's low level in this system, and he is also, for someone who believes that he's going to become successful and famous, he's leaving it a little late because, he tells us that he's already in his 40s, and he's like, well, I'm still starting out, right? Even though I've been doing this for 20 years, he's still at the bottom of the ladder, but he believes that he'll still make it up. All right. So we have him here, and one of his main jobs that he seems to be talking about all the time is he says he keeps mending pens, and probably all of you are like, why do these pens keep breaking? Why don't they just buy some new pens, right? But of course, they don't use pens like we do today, right? The normal everyday pens like this, or a ballpoint pen like some of you have, right? These were the days when they're still using feathered quills, right? So a big feather, and of course the end of it needs to be sharpened, right? So as you're writing, eventually the little blade that you've made on the end of the feather starts to get blunt, starts to break, starts to be no good for writing anymore. So you have to get a knife and you have to trim off the bits that are breaking and make a new point, right? So that you have your quill is useful for writing again, okay? So of course the method was you take the feather, dip it in some ink, write on the paper, okay? And then when the end of the pen starts to get unusable, take a knife, trim it off, make a new sharp end, dip it in the ink again, and keep writing, right? So you could do this several times with a feather, and then you eventually had to throw it away. Okay? But that's what he talks about. That's what he's talking about when he means, oh yeah, my boss was having me mend the pens. I spent all morning doing this, right? So he's just taking a knife and sharpening those feathers. So he's there in the office, and he sees his boss, right? Who's the senior official, right? And this senior official has, it turns out, quite a lovely daughter, right? And Propashin thinks that she's quite beautiful, and he decides that he's in love with her. Right? And he also refers to her as if she is an empress, like the female form of an emperor, the empress. And he keeps on calling her in his mind, anyway, not aloud, but in his mind, he keeps on calling her Your Excellency, like you would to an empress. Now, the first sign of madness, of course, that we get is that he's walking down the street one day, and he believes that he recognizes a random woman's dog. Right? He's like, oh, I know that dog. Her name's Maggie. She's a popular socialite dog. Right? She knows all the dogs around the area, and he's startled to hear her talk, and he hears the dog talking to another dog, Fidel, and talking about the letters that she has been writing, and she's like, I didn't know dogs could write letters. Right? Wow, that's quite a revelation. I would like to learn about these letters. Okay, so already we're seeing those signs of madness. Of course, dogs can't speak. They can't, it's not real. They can't speak. They can't write letters. They can't even hold a feather in their paws. Right? So, yes. So he has these fantasies about it, and these two dogs having this conversation, and he notices where the woman who owns the dog, where she lives, right? He makes a note of it, and so he's like, I'll check this out later on. We then see that he goes to the office, and he has excuse me, a brief encounter with the boss's daughter, who comes in, and he has this very awkward moment with her, and we see that he tells us all these things that are going on in his mind, and all the things that he wants to tell her, and that he wants to behave a certain way before her, and then the reality of it is that he just comes across as this very boring, ordinary civil servant to her. He does some other things along the way, where he goes to the theater. He has various other fantasies, and he has these moments where he says, I have this these moments of inspiration where these brilliant ideas come to me, right? And he's like, oh, I know what I'll do. I will go and find the letters that the dog, Maggie, was talking about. And so he goes back to that house where the dog's owner was, and he knocks on her door, and he sort of says, hey, I'm here to collect the letters. And she's like, who are you? What do you want? And he's like, comes in, and he goes over to the dog's bed, which we assume she sort of made up the bed out of bits of paper, probably some scrap paper and so on that she had lying around. She's made a bed out of it for the dog. And he goes and he grabs some of these random papers, and he takes them, and he's like, I found the letters, thank you, goodbye, right? And meanwhile, this woman is like, okay, glad I could help you, This kind of, this is meant to be a sort of like this ironic, comical scene, right? Where you have this crazy guy comes in, rifles through your dog's bed, takes some random pieces of paper and is like, thanks you for giving them to him, and then leaves, right? So then, over the next couple of pages, we get some of Proposition transcribes for us some of these notes that he believes are from the dog, right? And in between, he gives his own little comments. So like he translates, or he transcribes rather, from the letters into the story, and then in between he's like, I don't think this is, I don't think this is interesting, or I don't think this is really what she's talking about, etc. Okay. So the more he becomes obsessed with the gossip that he believes that the dogs are saying about him, and also as he gets news about various other things, such as the fact that the beautiful daughter is getting married to someone, right? The more he sort of withdraws from the normal things that he should be doing, like going to work, for example, right? And so instead, he just stays at home, and instead of going to the office, he just obsesses about these ideas. And then he hears in the news that the King of Spain has died. Right? This, of course, is another transition that happens in the story, another turning of the plot. And he hears about this idea, and he starts thinking, well, I've read all of these adventure stories, and I've heard of certain historical cases where someone who was like a prince was raised by a normal, ordinary, common family, and then one day they discovered that they were really a prince. What if that's me? It's like, no, I'm not sure about that. And then he makes the leap, right? The next day, he's like, wait a minute, maybe I am the King of Spain. I am. I must be the King of Spain, right? And so he decides, he tells his housekeeper that he's the king of Spain. And he's like sort of sits her down. He's like, all right, I have a surprise for you, right? You're not gonna believe this, but I'm the king of Spain, right? And she's like, you're crazy. But he thinks, oh, you're just so, she was just so shocked. She was just so surprised and happy for him that he is the king of Spain. So then there are various other comical things that he does. He goes out for a walk, and he says, like, I went out incognito, like no one knew I was the king of Spain, right? Because I went out in disguise, right? No one knew, of course, he isn't, but he believes that he's disguised himself. He goes out for a walk, and then eventually, after he gets some notes that he should return to work, he eventually goes into the office, right? And there he also acts all arrogant and as if he really is the king, right? And expects the people there all to respect him for his position and to bow before him. So our story ends with what he believes are the officials coming to take him over, like from St. Petersburg, which is the Russian city where he's living in the story, and to take him from St. Petersburg to Madrid in Spain to make him the king, right? And he gets to the king's court in Spain, which of course is what, really? Yeah, it's an insane asylum, right? It's a psychiatric ward. So he thinks, of course, that he's being taken to the court of the King of Spain, but really he's being taken away by the doctors to put him in an insane asylum, and the other people that he sees with all their heads shaven are all the other crazy inmates that he sees in there, right? And so he's like, this is really strange. Like these Spanish people, they have such weird customs for how they treat their kings, right? They do all sorts of strange things to them, right? And of course, he keeps on trying to justify the fact that he is the king with all this, all the behavior that he is forced to endure as inmate in the asylum. So it ends with him worrying about various things, about the sky and the moon falling down on our heads, etc. But in the end, he's fully, obviously mad, right? He's gone from being like sort of, the door is a little bit open at the very beginning of the story, and then his madness goes wide open by the end. Okay, so we've talked about previously about those three features of romanticism: nature, right, the emotions, and the sort of the misfit individual, the individual who doesn't fit into society. Now, this particular story, of course, fits very much into that second value of the romantic fiction that we're looking at, right? So also consider our theme, right, for this first part of the course, which is that of folly and madness, right? And we've seen that both of those, they're connected, not because people who do foolish things, we all do foolish things at certain points in our lives, but people who are foolish and people who are mad, what they have in common is that they are not using reason and logic to the full extent that they're supposed to, right? And the Romantics are interested in exploring this idea because, as we said, for them, the emphasis of the Enlightenment, the period before Romanticism, was precisely upon reason and logic and using those things to perfect society and politics and even ourselves and other things like technology. Whereas the Romantics, they tend to be saying, well, humans do have logic and do have reason. They don't deny that. But they also talk about how important the imagination and how important the emotional and sometimes irrational side of us is as well to our existence, and this is where our ideas of art and so on come from. Now, what we see happening in this story to some extent is that this author is living in a world that is quite cold and rational, right? The work system in which he's in is quite brutal and sort of dog-eat-dog kind of world, right? It's a very harsh sort of world. And so his imagination, his creativity and so on seem to be stifled. And the madness could be seen as a sort of compensation, a way out for him, right? That it overstimulates his imagination to the point where he starts to go crazy. So the picture you see here, this is by Michelangelo. It's actually a copy of his from when he was young. Like, this is a big part of what artists do when their first training is that they learn, just like if you're a musician, right, and you want to become a good musician or a good composer, you play and you copy the works of like the great composers and the great musicians that came before you. So what artists do when they're in training is that they will copy like the styles and like literally copy painting for painting to see if they can reproduce the styles of other artists. So this is an early copy of someone else's artist by Michelangelo. What it depicts here is this character here is Saint Anthony, right? In the early tradition of Christianity, there were lots of saints who would go out into the desert and live as hermits. They'd live these very tough, ascetic, pleasure-denying sort of lifestyles. But St. Anthony was particularly famous because he was constantly tormented by temptations that came just purely out of his own mind, right? So if he was tempted by food or by sex or by whatever it is, right, to sin, he would have all these visions that like he believed that the devil was sending to him. So this is what this picture symbolizes. Here is St. Anthony in the middle, and he's being pulled apart or torn or picked up by all of these demons that are created by his mind in the picture. It was a popular image, not just like during the time of Romanticism, but even before that as well. So you can see Michelangelo painting it about it. So this overstimulation of the imagination seems in this story, as I said, to come from the repression of too much logic, too much reason, a society that doesn't care about art, about literature, about creativity, about any of those sorts of things, and forces our main character into madness by not allowing him a creative outlet for his thoughts and abilities. Okay? So this is also, of course, the other area of romantic themes that we see this fits into, of course, is that third one, right? Propashin is obviously a misfit, right? He doesn't fit in, even though outwardly to everyone else, right? At the beginning of the story, he does look like he is just an ordinary guy, right? He looks like he's boring, ordinary, just sort of like Rip Van Winkle does. But then these experiences that he has turns him into something that is a bit weird and a bit different, right? So Rip Van Winkle, not as extreme, right? But not everyone, gets to sleep for 20 years and wake up in a totally different world. In the same way, this character here, Propashin, he also has these experiences that change him. Okay, so this power, this very strong power of the imagination, the central part of how the Romantics look at the world. Now, this final part of the story, this transformation that goes on when Propashin, our narrator, makes this very, very vast leap in logic, doesn't he? Right? Because he's sort of like, I've heard stories where people could be like princes or kings or princesses or whatever without realizing it. Right? They've been adopted by a common family. Right? They've been raised without knowledge of their heritage, and then they're rediscovered. Right? And it's sort of like he tells us about this in one diary entry, and then suddenly he jumps in the next entry to saying, wait a minute, that's me. I must be one of these people, right? He doesn't establish why. Right? He doesn't give us any logic, but he just makes this connection, right? Makes this leap of logic. And similarly, we see him do other things like this where earlier in the story, for instance, where people think he's a bit strange or a bit weird. What does he usually say about these people when he sort of like, he feels some hostility or some condescension from them? He has one strategy in particular that he uses on almost everyone. Yeah, he's like, they're jealous of me, right? He's like, they're jealous of, you know, how talented I am, or they're jealous that, you know, I am going to make it and they're not, right? And so every time someone looks down upon him or shows any sort of contempt for him, he's like, they're just doing it because they're jealous, right? They're just jealous. I mean, I know my clothes are ragged and out of fashion. I know I don't have any money. I know that, you know, I'm older, but, you know, you just watch one day. Like, just give me a chance. I will make my career. I will make lots of money. I will marry the beautiful woman, right? And of course, all of this is delusion. It's not real. Now, the metaphor that we have here towards the end of the story of him being the king of Spain is particularly chosen by Gogol, in my opinion anyway. This is my interpretation. Because this notion that we have of human beings being in control of themselves, right? This idea that, you know, and it's an assumption, of course, particularly of the law, right? If you do something wrong, right? So if I commit a crime, then I am held responsible for my actions, right? It's like said that I decided to commit the crime, right? And that's what that notion is called sovereignty, right? So this idea of sovereignty is that you have control over your own actions. That's what it means in sort of the idea of personal sovereignty, right? There are various other kinds of sovereignty. There's national sovereignty, which is the idea that nations have the right to do whatever they want in their own country, right? They have the right to make their own laws and to do their own thing. And the most common sort of in this time period notion of the sovereign is that of the king, right? And often you'll hear kings referred to as the sovereign, right? So this word means being in charge, right? Being in charge, being sovereign. So personal sovereignty, I am in charge of my own actions. National sovereignty, a nation is in charge of its own laws and running itself. King as a sovereign, someone who is in charge as the king, as the ruler. So one of the things that sort of Gogol gets us to question with this story is how much of our actions, how much of human behavior is really something that we are in charge of, right? How much of what we do, how much of what we think, how much of the actions that we perform, how much are we really in charge of them? Because we see that, you know, our character, you know, as he gets more and more crazy, also becomes more and more convinced that he is the king and that he is in charge, right? So this is, of course, a question that, you know, is ongoing into the 19th century, into the 20th century, into even now, when we, of course, if you study psychology, if you study science, behavioral science, and so on, those fields are all interested in this question of like how much of our behavior is instinctive and ingrained by our biology or by our upbringing or by our environment, and how much of it is actual choice, right? And so other thinkers later on, like Freud and so on, would continue to question how much of us, how much of what we think of what we do is actually us deciding as opposed to other factors as well, right? So that's a very, very difficult question to answer, right? Probably an impossible question for us to answer. how much we are driven by other factors and how much we are in charge of ourselves, right? How much we have absolute responsibility for our actions. But it is something that the romantics are fascinated with, particularly because those two second facets of or two themes I've talked about, the emotions. When we feel strong emotions, are those things that we decide upon? Do we say, oh, I'm going to feel happy today, or I'm going to fall in love with that person, or any of those sorts of things? They're not conscious decisions, are they? Right? All those, particularly the strongest of emotions, tend to be passions that we don't drive, but actually that drive us, right? So a lot of these romantic characters, a lot of these romantic heroes, and particularly anti-heroes, are characters that are driven by passions, by emotions, by things that they can't control, right? So like we've talked about many other characters outside of our reading, so Faust and Frankenstein and so on. Let's add to that list with this kind of passion, something like in Moby Dick, there's a character of Captain Ahab, right? And he wants revenge against this white whale, Moby Dick, right? But his passion to do this is not something he simply decides, yeah, I hate that whale, I'm deciding to go out and kill it, right? He's driven by this passion, right? It's like he doesn't have any control over himself anymore, to the point where it actually, if you read the book, it destroys him, it consumes him, right? So this is something that, as I said, the romantics are very interested in, the way in which those emotions, those passions, they can even completely undermine our sense of sovereignty. They can drive us in certain ways where we are not in control, right? So, of course, there's always a fine balance. There's always, there are certain things, even in the most rational, grounded, sane person, there are things about our character and the way that we behave that we can't control. But then we see characters like in these stories in our first section here and later on too, that slip into madness, like in The Telltale Heart, like in this story, or into making decisions that are seen as, we could see as being foolish, whether it's Rip Van Winkle or Don Juan, making choices that ultimately are not too smart, but are all tend to be driven by bigger passions than that. Right. So, to sort of summarize then, we could see Gogol is looking at the way, first of all, we have this unreliable narrator whose logic and whose faults in his logic we sort of have to follow, right? The way in which he projects ideas onto people, projects ideas onto himself, has all these defense mechanisms where he's, anyone criticizes him, he's like, you're just jealous of me, right? And we also see that Gogol uses this to explore this irrational, emotional side of our souls that the romantics are so interested in. And as it says there, you could also read this story as being a response to the fairly sort of cold and logical world in which Propashin, our main character, lives. And this is his way of escaping from that. It's an unhealthy way, but it shows just for the romantics just how important developing not only the logical, rational side of us is, but also that emotional side to us as well. Okay, so let's turn now to our prep sheets, to our homework, and see what are some of the parts of the story that you guys picked out for discussion. Let's see. Haeyeon, what did you pick up? Page 32. Second paragraph, yep.
This passage shows that this man blames other people for his shabby life. I think this passage shows the time before he was born to mad and gave the reason why he began to a madman. He felt that his boss and other people lived well, but in contrast, he had no money and his job is meaningless. And this indicates that he thought his failure of his life is not due to himself, but because of other people and society. And eventually it made him lure further to the reality and made him blind to the reality and became a man.
Yes, good. So yeah, in this passage, we see that he uses that strategy of saying, this guy, he looks down upon me, right? Which may or may not be true, like because his perceptions of how other people look at him seems to be also very distorted by his own mindset, right? So whether someone is really looking down upon him or not, he's too unreliable to know, right? But he believes that this other person is looking down upon him, and then, like you say, in turn, he then reacts back aggressively only in his own mind, right? He doesn't actually do or say anything by projecting, oh wow, one day I will be rich and one day I will have great clothes and we'll see who's the better person then, right? Is it this fantasy that he has as this kind of defense mechanism, right? This way of retaliating even though no one has actually said or concretely done anything to him, right? So yes, it's a good passage to see that particular mindset at work. Good. Okay, Gustav?
Paragraph chosen is on page 37, the second paragraph. Perhaps I'm really a counter general and then we appear to be a titular counselor. What I find striking there is this idea of constructivism that we see there, which is far later in our times kind of important scientific movement maybe, and this is where he develops step by step now the idea that he's maybe this king or a gentleman at least.
Yep. Yes. So for those of you who are not familiar with this term of constructivism, it's sort of the opposite term is essentialism, right? Which would be like that you are who you are, and like nothing can change that, and there's some sort of like core to you that you are. Whereas constructivism is the idea that like society shapes and molds who you are and what you become, right? So one is you always are that way. You're essentially, you're like born this person, and that's always who you are and who you will be. And this idea that our personality is developed and changes and is constructed over time, constructive idea.
I mean, to me, the main conflict in that story was that gap between rich and poor, between the mighty and the powerless, and this concentrates on this.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, of course, this is like these kinds of fantasies that our character has of being eventually of being a king. Here at the moment, he's just like generalizing about like some kind of higher position that he could have, right? So he says there, I could be a count, so which is kind of a lord, or a general, and maybe I am one of those things, but I only appear to be, a low-ranking bureaucrat, right? A titular counselor. And then notably, notice the next sentence there where he says, perhaps I don't even know who and what I am, right? So he creates this kind of, doubt in his own mind deliberately to be like, well, maybe all this is an illusion. Maybe it's just a dream that I'm living in this crappy job that I don't like, and I'm poor and all that sort of stuff. Maybe the reality is something else, right? So he uses that kind of logic to get out of his situation. Okay, Tian?
I picked the paragraph on page 29.
Mm-hmm.
Second
Page 30. Yep.
From the bottom, third paragraph. At the surface, I thought that the narrator was complimenting this man.
Mm-hmm.
When I read all the words in this paragraph, I found out that he is using sarcasm to just make fun of me.
Yes.
Yes.
So why did you think this was important? What's important about this use of sarcasm in praising his boss?
From the beginning, he's making all comments about his coworkers and his boss.
Yep.
And sometimes there are, like, even though it's the narrator's part, but he's like blaming others
Mm-hmm.
for making all the troubles.
Yes.
So
Yep.
I thought this is the procedure where he is becoming mad.
Yep. Yep. So one of the things that paragraph tells us, like you said, it looks like a compliment at first, right? So if you read the first sentence of that paragraph, our director must be a very clever man. Right? That sounds like a compliment. The whole room is full of bookcases. Yeah, it must be clever. I read the titles of some of the books. They were very learned. Beyond the comprehension of people of my class, and all in French and German. Yeah, it must be. I look at his face, see how much dignity there is in his eyes. I never hear a superfluous word from his mouth, except when he hands over the documents and he asks, what sort of weather is it? So you're right, when you first read that, the tone seems to be, he's saying, yeah, my boss, he's a smart guy, like he has all these books and he can read French and German and like he's smarter than a lowly person like me. But when you read it again, knowing his perspective, you're absolutely right, it is sarcastic, right? And so when you read that first sentence again, our director must be a learned man, right? Oh, yeah, how smart he is. He has all these books, right? And this is the real tone of that paragraph, is that he's being sarcastic, and then even his last sentence where he's like, I never hear him say a useless word, and then he's like, except when right now when he hands me the documents, he just makes a banal comment about like, what's the weather like, basically, right? So this kind of tone, right, this is very, very, very important for both reading this story and many of the other stories that we read. Because if you read a lot of these stories too seriously, right, if you just take them at face value, if you just take literally what the characters say, you'll miss a lot of the depth of the stories, right? Because what these authors are trying to do is they're using the tone to test our intelligence, right? To see how carefully are we reading this? Are we able to pick up these often really subtle shifts in meaning and in the ideas that are being expressed here, right? Just like in The Telltale Heart, like if we were to take the narrator seriously, oh yeah, he's very calm, he's very rational, yeah, okay, he chopped up a body, yeah, right? So if we take that too literally, then we miss the point of the story. Whereas these stories teach us to read very carefully, particularly in these cases, for the tone in which they're said. It totally changes it. Like Chen said, if we just read it too seriously, it looks like a compliment. It looks like he's saying one thing. But if we go and look at the actual tone of it, it's sarcastic, it's ironic, and therefore it is not meant, it's meant in a different way than we're originally reading it. Okay, Justin?
I think it's on page 31, where it starts with in the middle of your excellency.
Mm-hmm.
And like just the entire the thought process in that, it talks about how he's like in love with his boss's daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden he changes emotions to like anger very fast.
Yes.
So it's kind of like it shows how he's not in like a right mind, because emotionally he goes from like love to hate, which is like very extreme on
Yes.
opposite sides. And also at the end, like the last sentence that I chose was, "Do you know then, you country bumpkin, that I am an official of an aristocrat birth?" So it's like that's when he starts to think he's like already like better than everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was an important part.
Yes, yes. And notice in that paragraph you picked out that begins with your excellency, that here is like there's a big difference between what he shows to the other characters and to the world that is outside of him, compared to what we see happening inside of his head and inside of his mind, right? So in his head, like he's saying all these flowery words and behaving like he's an aristocrat and being condescending to this woman, like in his mind, this is what's happening. What does he actually say to her? Yeah. So he's like, in his mind, he's like, "Yes, Your Excellency, you know, I'm please be kind to me. You are so beautiful. Oh, I love you so much," etc. Right? And he's like imagining that he's saying these things in this flowery language, and you know that he's her equal and he's an aristocrat, and right? And in reality, he's sort of like, "No, he's not here yet. No," right? So this vast disparity by what's going on in his mind compared to what the outside world is seeing, right, is really important for how we understand this story too. Because he takes that inside world, right, what he is thinking in his head as being sort of the real version of things. Whereas, like, what is actually happening on the outside is something very different. Okay. Hiro?
On page 37.
Yep. Page 37.
Oh, no, sorry, 39. The second to last paragraph. I thought it was like, because like he's turning more mad, and
Yep.
I thought it was important because this was like sort of the evidence. Because in the beginning, he like sort of admitted that he could like listen and hear and see things that other people couldn't. But he actually admitted it. But on this in this paragraph, it has actually gotten out of his hands. So like he's advising us to do something and believe him. So I thought it was pretty much like the last step of like him getting mad.
Mm-hmm. And notice that this chancellor of the state that he keeps talking about here is obviously, he's the doctor, right? He's a doctor in the insane asylum. And he's trying to cure the main character, the narrator. And so he, you know, it's not a very nice cure. The 19th century treatment of mad people is still not terribly good, and not terribly advanced by today's standards. And he's basically, you know, like, if you tell me again that you're the king, then you know I'm going to beat you up, right, kind of thing. And he's like, I know, it was just a test, right? Like, they want me to prove that I really am the king, and so he again integrates that into his mad fantasies.
About the Spain and China one as well. Like,
Yes.
yeah, he believes that it's like one kingdom and like yeah.
Yes, and of course, those kinds of observations about like Spain and China, he's like, I came to this realization, like Spain and China, they're the same country. Don't you get it? Right? And we're like, no, I don't get it at all, right? Or he's like, aren't you worried? Like the moon's going to fall on our heads. Like we need to do something, right? So the earlier kinds of leaps of logic, right? They don't make sense. Right? So him deciding that he is the king of Spain, they don't make sense in the sort of like everyday picture of the world. But we understand why someone would have those fantasies, don't we? Right? We understand why if you are from an unsuccessful, low-class background where you feel like you've been bullied and rejected and hurt and so on, then it's understandable that you might have these kinds of fantasies of power and of being respected and of being rich and like all the things that you are not, right? That kind of leap of logic from our perspective, from a reader's perspective, makes sense. But then as we get towards the end of the story, there are these certain kinds of statements and logic that we really see the depth of his madness. Now it's just nonsense, right? Spain and China being the same country, the moon falling on our heads, etc. They don't make any logical sense at all, right? There's no way that we can say, oh, well, maybe Spain and China are the same country. Maybe they've been making a mistake all these years. No, right? There's nothing about that is possible, right? So yes, it does really show us the full depths of his madness is the way in which he does this. Good. Chongwon?
Said their opinion about it. I chose the same paragraph as the other people. Page 30, starting from our
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I didn't see the things beyond the surface.
Uh-huh.
So, he was serious about what he was saying, and along with this paragraph, page 32, the director likes to see towards the last paragraph. Many things lying on his table, so I thought he was feeling inferior toward the high classman, like the high status person.
Yep.
And so he respected the person, but it was like to the extreme. So it was like almost he was feeling old towards the person.
Yep.
So I thought we could, and also from the part that he's declaring himself as a king, and in the last part, I thought if we gather all these things together, we could see that how unfair he actually feels inside.
Mm-hmm. Yes, good. Yep. So, and one of the things that as the semester goes along, the more you read these kinds of stories and the more you have experience with this kind of reading, the easier, of course, it then becomes to recognize the different tones and different themes and ideas. So, we've talked about like those three main themes of romanticism. We've talked about like the intertwining of opposites and conflict between opposite ideas like good and evil, light and dark, and so on, madness and rationality. So by the time you get to the midterm and you've read a number of these stories, you're going to be like, oh, I get it. Like this guy is doing something similar to what Poe was doing, to what Balzac was doing, to what Irving was doing, etc. Right? So this is why, of course, we tie all of these things together in Romanticism, is that they have these elements in common, and certainly by the midterm and probably by the end of the semester, definitely, you'll have a strong grasp of like what ties these stories together. What are these sort of common themes, even though they're all different stories, even though there are a number of different authors on our course, right? There are these certain links that tie them together. Okay, Eleanor?
I chose the line "dogs are much more clever than men" earlier when he was reading the letters.
Yep.
I thought that this might have been a sarcastic remark by the author that did not think that people are particularly smart, and that it was used by the main character to kind of display his superiority over other people, that he's like really smart and like amazing, and everyone else is like less than dogs, kind of.
Yes, and of course, there is like it's not a particularly nice connotation of the word, but like to refer to people as dogs has a long-standing cultural connotation of being someone who is like an animal, who's low, right? And he actually refers to like his superiors at one point, like on page 36. There's a kind of play on words there because it says, "You lie, cursed dog, what a scandalous tongue." And we can't tell whether he's referring back to the letters about like being written by the dogs, or whether he's like referring to his superiors in this part, right? Because of course a dog, like that cursed dog, can be used to refer to someone who is like that you have contempt for, as well as the dogs being used as the metaphor of the magical speaking and writing dogs, right? So yes, this kind of paranoid fantasy that he has also plays into the sort of the feelings of inferiority and particularly class relations that he experiences in there. Now, did anyone notice the dates in this story? Right? So if you go to the beginning, of course, it starts all very normally. Right? So we have, October the 3rd is the first date. Right? And as it goes along, some of the days were not given dates. October 4th is the second one. November 6th. Right? November 8th. November 11th, November 12th. So up to this point, all quite normal. November 13th, December 3rd, December 5th, December 8th. And then suddenly, on page 37, and from there on, the dates become quite strange. So suddenly, it's the year 2000, April 43rd. Now, of course, we know this story is published in 1835, so it's clearly not the year 2000. And does April have 43 days in it? No. Right? So then, the next one is Marchember 86, between day and night. Right? Somewhere between day and night. The next one, on top of page 39, is no date. The day had no date, right? The date didn't exist on this particular day. Then the next one, just the first, right? Then Madrid, February 30th. It looks right at first, doesn't it? And then you're like, wait a minute, February doesn't have 30 days in it, right? So this date also doesn't exist. And then our last two on page 40 are January in the same year following after February, right? So it's January, then February, and he's like, oh, it's January again, right? And then our final two there, the 25th, so it's just a random, like could be any day, 25th, and then last one, 34th of March, 34th of March, February 349, right? So this another little sort of like trick that Gogol uses, a little detail that Gogol uses, that at a certain point from page 37 onwards in our story, like the dates, none of them make any sense, right? They're all weird dates, or dates that have no date, or dates that don't exist, like 30th of February, or they jumped into the year 2000, or we're just given a very non-specific sort of day, like it's the 1st or the 25th or whatever, right? So this is another way in which he does it. Okay, so to look forward to next week. Next week, I believe, is our last of this section on Folly and Madness. All right, so next week we have a couple of American stories, Hawthorne's Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, which is a story about folly, and Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. So that will close out our look at this first theme of folly and madness, and then when we return after that week, we begin our second topic for this course, which is that of religion and superstition. Okay. All right, thank you guys. Enjoy your weekend. Please hand in your prep sheets as you go, and I will see you on Tuesday. Thank you.